Chapter 9. Millions of us were wiped out when the seas rose and engulfed Kamino. We survived as a species because we were willing to think the unthinkable. Some genetic characteristics helped us survive the starvation and overcrowding, and some did not, and there was no room for sentiment or for weaklings. We culled, we refined, we selected. The prospect of extinction forged us into the species we designed ourselves to be, the purest expression of the Kaminoan spirit, and at a level of social maturity that weaker mongrel species will never attain, because they lack the courage to cull. We are the masters of genetics and sole arbiters of our fate, never to be at the mercy of chance again. Draft memoirs of former chief scientist Kosai on Kaminoan eugenics and the desirability of the caste system, never published. Ayat City, Kaftakar, Outer Rim, 477 days after Geonosis. The bodies of the two covert ops troopers were much heavier than Darman expected. The wait for Niner and Fee to show up 2 hours was the longest of his life, and every creak and click made him think the Ayat police were surrounding the apartment. When his brothers finally arrived, he felt inexplicably guilty, as if he had to explain himself. Niner stood staring down at the two troopers. "Have you tidied them up, Dar?" Darman had done his best. Apart from the damage to the one he'd shot in the face, they both looked quite peaceful now. They looked like him, but dead, and he was having a hard time dealing with that. Their arms were neatly at their sides, legs straight. I felt bad leaving them lying around like meat. What are we going to do with them? Fee shrugged. Can't leave them here as air fresheners. Fee, they're our own. Darman couldn't bear looking at the faces any longer and grabbed a blanket from the bedroom. We have to dispose of them properly. We've got their armor, Fee said. Sergeant Cal will want the tallies. He's funny about that. Okay, let me put it another way. What if that was your carcass lying there? What would you want done with it? I'd want someone to shake their head and say, "What a waste of such a fine-looking and stylish young man." And then give me a big state funeral, Fee said, taking the blanket out of Darman's hands and rolling one of the covert ops troopers in it. With loads of women weeping that they never had the chance to sample my charms. But apart from that, I wouldn't give a mott's backside by then, would I? It's just a temporary shell. Only the armor lasts. Niner sneaked a glance out of the window. It'll be dark in an hour or so. We'll take them back to camp and bury them. Dispose of the armor somewhere remote. And tell the lizards not to dig them up and eat them. Dar, marks don't eat other sentients, just their own dead. Oh, that's all right then. Dar, these guys tried to kill you. No, they came for Soul, Sarge. And that's just what you were ready to do not so long ago. Remember? Darman had no problem killing. It was his job. He'd grown used to it. And he didn't even get the bad feelings and nightmares afterward that they said humans usually had. But he killed his own comrades, not an enemy. The circumstances didn't make him feel any better. I don't think I could ever go after my own like that no matter what. Not unless it was personal and they'd done something terrible to me. He realized he was blathering. Even Fee gave him an odd look. Niner bundled the second trooper into a blanket, and Darman helped him. The dead trooper's muscles hadn't stiffened yet, and when Darman bent one of them over, the movement forced the air from the man's lungs. He emitted a distressing sighing noise that made him sound as if he'd come back to life. Darman had seen some unpleasant things in battle, but that moment was seared into his memory as one he knew he'd never forget. By the time the bodies were trussed with fiber cord, they could have passed for lumpy carpets in bad lighting. Aiden's been told that the assault on Iyad is probably going to be in a week's time, Niner said, seeming unconcerned. So it wouldn't matter if we left them here. No, we bury them. Okay. I mean it. Dar, am I arguing? It would have made more sense to run. The longer they waited here, the more at risk they were. It wasn't hot outside, and with the environment controls in the apartment turned right down and the window sealed, It might have been a couple of weeks before the neighbors smelled that anything was amiss. But that wasn't good enough, even if they had been sent to shoot Sol. Fee wandered into the kitchen. The conservator door sighed open and then shut again. He came out with a plate of food in one hand and a single fritter cake in the other, which he held up to Darman. "Eat," he said. "Go on, or I'll sulk." Darman accepted the cake and chewed, but it stuck in his throat like sawdust. He had an urge to call Attain. It was the first time he'd ever felt the need to seek comfort from someone outside, rather than from his immediate circle of brothers, and it made him feel disloyal, as if their reassurance and support were no longer enough for him. "You should talk to Culber," Niner said quietly. "He killed a commando by accident. Remember? He probably knows better than anyone what you're going through." "I'm not going through anything." Darman suddenly felt transparent and exposed. "I'm just getting jumpy waiting for the cops to show up. How nobody heard the blaster noise, I'll never know." "The place is well insulated," Fee said gently. "Pretty well soundproof except for the floors creaking." Darman knew he wasn't fooling anyone, and retreated to the kitchen to wait for darkness on the pretext of clearing out the cupboards. Yes, he'd talked to Skirata. Whatever Cal had been through was worse. He'd shot a commando in training during a live fire exercise, one of his own boys, and even though everyone knew accidents like that happened, Skirata was never the same afterward. It had to be much, much harder to live with, causing the death of someone you cared about. The covert ops troopers were relative strangers. But Darman had heard that ARC troopers were ready to kill clone kids, rather than let SEP forces take them during the attack on Kamino, not for their own good, or to save them from anything, but to deny them as assets to the enemy. Would Sol have hesitated to kill a brother clone who got in his way? Darman doubted it. It was all getting too blurred and messy lately. He longed for the good old days, when the enemy was just tinnies and very easy to spot. "Okay, let's make a move," said Niner.
Nah.
Niner brought a speeder right up to the front of the apartments, so that was what had taken 2 hours. Then, acquiring more transport, and they moved the bodies like rolls of carpet. A few people were about on the street, but they took no notice, probably thinking someone was moving house. Then Fee went to collect Darman's speeder, while Niner and Darman waited in the vehicle with the bodies in the back. "Nice strong cup of calf when we get back," Miner said. His voice had every single intonation then that Skirata's did, all reassurance and concern. "You'll be okay, Dar." What if they weren't actually going to kill me? I never waited to find out. "Sarge, do you suppose they just come to arrest Sol?" "No," Niner said firmly. "They came to execute him. And even if they'd arrested you, they'd only have been taking you back so someone else could kill you. So stop replaying the holovid in your head and accept it was them, or you, Enyar Vodika." Sometimes Darman thought that he alone knew what was going on in his mind, and then one of his brothers would tell him exactly what he was thinking. On balance, exposed or not, he was more comforted to know he wasn't alone or going crazy. They drove out of town with Darman occasionally directing Niner, who was working from the holo chart in his datapad. Fee followed behind in the other speeder. It was all going fine under the circumstances anyway, until the red and green strobing lights of the local law enforcement patrol vehicle shot past them. "He's in a hurry," said Niner. "Late for his calf break." That was what Captain Obram always said when he saw one of his CSF speeders misbehaving. Darman glanced in the rear view to check that Fee hadn't dropped too far behind. "Doesn't look like they get too much trouble in this place. Not exactly the lower levels of 000. Everywhere's got its lower levels, Dar." He felt that if he kept chatting like a normal person, everything would be all right. He thought that right up to the moment when the police speeder braked and came to a halt, the illuminated matrix between its rear jets flashing a single word: "Stop." "Oh, sick," Niner muttered. "I think he means us." "Tell me this isn't stolen, Nervod." "It's not. And we're not over the speed limit either." Niner slowed down. Darman could see Fee dropping farther behind to stop outside a tap calf. "Now, nice and calm," Niner said. Let's hope he thinks we're twins. How many folks know what clones look like anyway? Especially here. Niner activated the comlink deep in his ear by clicking his back teeth. Darman felt his own embedded earpiece vibrate for a moment as it started receiving the signal. Then Niner lowered the side viewport and put on his sensible but blank expression as the red-uniformed officer walked up to the speeder with one hand on the blaster at his belt. "Good evening, officer. What's the problem?" "Keep your hands where I can see them, sir, and show me what you've got in the back." The officer leaned slightly to stare at Darman. "You step out of the vehicle and put your hands on the roof." For a moment, Darman thought Niner was going to throw the door open and knock the guy down, but he gritted his teeth and popped the rear hatch. Fee's voice filled Darman's skull. "He's on his own, Dar. I can drop him from here." "Wait." And then Darman got out of the speeder slowly and left the door open for a rapid retreat, but he edged far enough down the length of the speeder to keep an eye on Niner. The officer leaned into the small cargo space at the back of the speeder, still keeping his hand on the butt of his blaster as if it was some comfort to him. He didn't seem to realize that turning his back on a suspect, two suspects, in fact, was risky, and Darman looked hard to see if he had some headset linking him to another officer nearby. But there was nothing. He was simply not used to dealing with serious criminals or commandos. "Had a report of a speeder being used to remove items from a residence, sir," the officer said. His voice was muffled as he leaned in, one hand taking some of his weight on the tailgate. "This one, in fact. Now, what do you reckon you've got here?" And the moment the cop moved his hand to the tightly wrapped body in the cargo area, his fate was sealed. It was almost as if they drilled for it. Niner jumped him and pinned him flat, face down, arm locked around his throat to silence him, while Darman stepped in and checked him for comlinks. Fee was now right behind them in the other speeder, shielding the tussle from view. Unlike the holovids, there was no quick blow to the head to render someone conveniently unconscious while you made your getaway, with no harm done beyond a headache when they regained consciousness. This was just a poor cop, like any of Obram's team. He'd stopped the wrong men at the wrong time. Darman's eyes met Niner's, and he knew he should have simply shot the cop as his instinct told him to, but he couldn't. Fee stepped in and rifled through the array of weapons on the officer's belt. "Ah," he said, the only word spoken in the whole incident, and selected a stun baton. He shoved it into the cop's armpit. It crackled just as Niner let go of him. The man stopped struggling and convulsed a couple of times. "There," said Fee. He hauled the officer onto the curb, where he slumped in a heap, hidden from the oncoming traffic by the other speeder. "Sorry about that, Sarge." "It's okay. I broke contact before I got a shock. Time to bang out fast." "Sorry." Darman jumped back into the passenger seat. There was more traffic around than he expected, but Niner shot straight out into it and burned toward the city exit. "Sorry. I should have—" "No harm done," Niner said. Fee overtook them and disappeared into the distance. Darman took out his DC-15 and kept it cradled in his lap, checking in the rear view until they were clear of the city limits. He was starting to worry that he'd lost his nerve. He'd never hesitated over taking a shot before. His thought process wasn't supposed to kick in and start arguing with his risk assessment. I could have compromised this mission, and that means I put my brothers at risk. If you'd shot him, it would have been another mess to clean up, Niner said, veering away from the road and weaving through the trees. Can't leave civvy cops dead all over the place. It's not Galactic City, is it? You're telepathic, Sarge. I was thinking what Skirata would have said, actually. We've still left a cop in Ayat who's seen us up close. Well, next time he sees us, we'll have our helmets on, so a fat lot of good that'll do him. Aiden and Fee were already waiting in the makeshift ops room when they reached the rebel camp, which appeared to be in darkness like the rest of the base. All the windows were shielded by blackout material. Inside the fragile-looking house, the two of them were sitting at the table and gazing forlornly at a datapad, and Aiden had his hand held against his ear, as if he was concentrating on a signal he could barely hear. Fee didn't look up. Aiden did. Wow, you're good, the Null said wearily. How many stiffs have you racked up tonight? 2 troopers and a cop. You're going to beat your own dumb record at this rate. We never killed a cop, Niner said. Fee simply looked over his shoulder at them. I didn't plan to. Stun battens are tricky things if you don't know the medical history of your target. Oh, great. Great. Fee tapped his data pad, and a crackling stream of audio filled the room. It was voice traffic from a police control room, judging by the jargon and codes. Say again, 3-7. Last call shown on the onboard log was a vehicle stop on Bedian Way. No deer surveillance holocam view available. Confirm ID on the suspect speeder. Rental, fake identity chip used to secure it. Hey, did anyone know he had a heart problem? Fee silenced it again and got up. Otten's digging a hole. I'll go and help him. I'm good at digging holes, really deep ones. Aiden shrugged and went back to listening to the circuit. I think the cops got excited when they found the stun baton burn on their buddy. Joining up the dots to work out that it was actually a covert commando team cleaning up a spillage is a step too far for them, thankfully. He leaned backward as far as his chair would go and grabbed another data pad. Now take a look at these aerial recce images. Darman took the pad, but Niner was still focused on the previous issue. So, Sergeant, what would you have done differently? I'd have shot the cop, said Aiden. And that would have solved the problem. How exactly? It wouldn't have changed a thing. It just worries me that you put being nice before doing the job right. We do extreme stuff. That means some unlucky saps get caught as collateral damage. Deal with it. Darman knew Aiden was right, and he was troubled by the fact that he'd hesitated. He was reacting to an internal template of police as Jailer Obram's kind allies, comrades, friends, and it was wholly wrong, and a recipe for disaster at some point in the future. He couldn't afford to judge anyone by their uniform. He couldn't even assume all Jedi were on his side now. If he found out that Zay was tasking special operations personnel to deal with deserters like that, he wasn't sure how he'd take it. I realize you're the explosive ordnance man, Aiden said, but can't you manage to interpret aerial images? Darman jerked out of his thoughts. Okay. Well? Darman stared at the flat images of what looked like the 2-dimensional map of a city, with a cron that showed it was recorded a few hours earlier. It was part of Ayat, not as a schematic of the construction that the Marats had worked to see, but a real image. He could see tiny dots moving along roads. A large compound in the heart of the city was packed full of repulsor trucks and armored vehicles of various types that hadn't been there a few days earlier when Omega was inserted. There was even mobile anti-air cannon. He handed the datapad to Niner for inspection. They're getting ready for our visit, then? Aiden nodded. No doubt their SEP allies have aerial reconnaissance of the accumulation of Republic souvenirs we've given the lizards. We can both spy on each other when we know where to look. So Ayat was bracing for a Marat assault. Other cities? Darman asked. All doing the same. I'm not sure if they understand how the lizards here cascade things, but it's unlikely they'll know about Leveler until she's looking for a parking space. A warship had been identified to deploy to Gaftakar then. It was imminent. Leveler. With a few thousand of the Republic's finest embarked 35th Infantry and 10th Armored, just to soften up Ayat and a few other major cities to allow the Marats to move in, then pull out when the dust has settled. Ayat wasn't well defended at all. From what Darman had seen, even one ship was overkill. Shenio Mining has enough resources to roll over Ayat and the government on its own without any military support if it wants to strip mine the place that badly. Yeah, but you know how companies like to look like they've been invited legally, or else people scream that it's corporate invasion. It is corporate invasion, Darman said. Maybe there's some strategy, some big picture we're not privy to, Aiden said. But in the end, all wars are about someone wanting something the other guy's got. If I thought that throwing a hydrospanner in the works would change the nature of the galaxy, I'd do it. But this is the way life works, chum. Let's just do the job and hope we stay alive long enough to move on. Niner didn't seem bothered. He looked much more interested in the recce data. Darman left the two sergeants to their own devices, retrieved his entrenching tool from his backpack, and went in search of Fee and Otten. In the quiet night air, it was easy to follow the sound of a shovel biting into the soil with that familiar metallic chinking sound. Fee and Otten, totally silent, were hacking away in a clearing fringed by small bushes, somewhere that roots would be less of a problem. Darman paused to look at the two bodies and joined in the digging by the faint, shielded light of a glow rod laid on the ground. 2 meters was deeper than it sounded. The three of them eventually stopped to stare down into the pit. "Should we have dug 2 graves?" Otten asked. Sergeant Cal said that Mando to use communal graves if they bury at all. Darman racked his brain, trying to remember what else Skirata had taught them about disposing of fallen comrades. He didn't care about what the book said about concealing signs they'd ever been there. This was about respect for men who were one simple designation prefix away from being him. And no soldier wants to be separated from his brothers. "Unless they're particularly Dekutla," Fee said. Atin squatted down over the bodies. "Okay, let's roll them in." "Can't we lower reverently instead?" Darman went over to the pile of purple armor and pried the ID tallies from the breastplates. When he ran his pocket sensor over them, they gave him the readouts CT 6000, 208,901, and CT 03687766. There was no indication of what they actually called each other, of course. The Grand Army didn't give a motlashebs about how clones like to be addressed, on the record at least. He did what he'd been avoiding for the last few hours, and interrogated the copy of the Null's database that Ordo had given them all back on 000. Once he knew their real names, he would feel even worse. But he needed to if he was going to give them any sort of farewell rite. They're Maz and Olun, and this was the worst bit. Jong trained them at one time. If Maz and Olun had harbored any ambitions beyond surviving the war, Jang might have been the only one who knew what they were. Those dreams probably didn't include getting killed by another clone. Fee and Otten lowered them into the pit, still wrapped. "Ni sukuyi, gar kiradich, ni parteli, gardara suum," Darman said. It was the ritual remembrance of those who'd passed on, recited daily with the names of all the people the mourner committed himself to immortalizing. "I'm still alive. You're dead. I'll remember you. So you're eternal." Sergeant Cal said that Mando Adi got straight to the point, even in spiritual matters. Maz and Olun. Fee threw a few handfuls of dirt into the pit, then picked up his shovel. "You know you've got to recite that every day for the rest of your life now, don't you?" "I know," said Darman, pitching loose soil back into the grave. "And how many more names by the time this war is over? It wasn't going to be hard to remember them. It was going to be much, much harder to forget." Ore Terminal. Karif City, Bog Fee, 478 days after Geonosis Twi'leks were much heavier than they looked. Maybe it was the Leku, because that tissue had to be pretty dense. Or maybe they were all muscle. Either way, it took a little more effort than Sev expected to restrain one. My, he said, grabbing Leb Chura in a headlock and slamming him into the warehouse wall. "You get around, don't you, delivery boy?" The Twi'lek hit the permacrete slabs with a loud, wet grunt, and Sev was sure he had a good grip on him until the pilot struggled free and made a run for it across the pitch-black landing strip. It was always a challenge when you couldn't immobilize targets the quick way, but Delta needed this one alive and talking. Sev tracked him in his night vision visor, a speed-blurred green figure with head-tails flapping as he ran. "Coming your way, Fixer." Leb ran full tilt toward his ship on the freight pad, and Sev raced after him. One downside of Katarn armor was that it was heavy okay for short, panicky sprints, but over any distance it slowed a man down, and Leb was opening the gap between them. No problem. Fixer and Scorch were waiting. The Twi'lek cannoned into a solid wall of Commando, Plastoid, and Dees as the two men intercepted him the hard way. Sev heard the oof of air expelled from his lungs. Leb was knocked flat on his back before being hauled upright and pinned between Fixer and Scorch. I know Sev's weird, pal, but it's rude to run away when he tries to be sociable. Scorch could put a charmingly menacing leer into his voice that Sev couldn't emulate. His gloved fingers tightened slowly on the Twi'lek's neck. He doesn't mean to bite. He's just being playful. What do you want? Leb gasped, getting his breath back. I've done nothing. I'm all legit. Who are you anyway? Mandalorians? 'Cause I've... Boss ambled across the landing strip. Don't break anything, General on deck. He tilted his head to indicate that Sev should look behind him. Bard Ika on your 6. Very anxious to do some interrogating. Leb, now's the time to enjoy the hospitality of the Republic, Scorch said, hauling the Twi'lek bodily toward Delta's traffic interdiction vessel. We just want to ask you a few harmless questions about your itinerary. Yeah, the questions might be harmless, but you're not... Leb now looked past Scorch and spotted Jusik jogging across the permacrete, Jedi robes flapping. Oh yeah, now the Jedi's going to zap me with his force powers, isn't he? Shove a lightsaber in. Jusik caught up with them. He always looked as if a strong breeze would knock him over. No lightsaber necessary, my friend. You haven't got any reason to withhold information, have you? When Jusik used that especially quiet, reasonable tone, and he never raised his voice anyway. Sev wasn't sure if he was using Jedi mind influence or not. There was always something disturbing about Jedi, even the approachable ones like Jusik. Sergeant Vao said it was a good idea never to turn your back on one. They weren't like regular folks. Would I know if he was using that mind stuff on me? Sev thought about that more and more lately. He still liked Jusik, though. So you've been delivering specialist equipment shipped in from Arcania, Boss said, and you don't have a permit for it. I don't need one, do I? You're from Ryloth, so you're a Republic citizen, and that makes trading in cloning equipment illegal. I'm not trading in anything, and I don't look in the crates. Arcania. They don't export fruit, do they? I'm a delivery boy, like you said. Your name showed up in a list we happen to have. Okay, arrest me then. Boss turned his head slowly to Sev, his silent cue to play the heavy. Jusik just watched, impassive. We don't do arrests, Sev said. We get answers. Give us one and we'll go away. Or I'll be very upset. Sev could make his knuckles crack alarmingly just by closing his fist. Tell me where you took the consignment. Leb's gaze wandered to the hatch as if he was calculating what he'd have to do to escape. Maybe it was just a reflex. His Leku were moving slightly in some wordless reaction. Why is everyone so interested in this stuff? Is it really glitterstim or something? The Mandalorians asked me the same thing where I took it. I thought it was just vats and permacrete and stuff. What Mandalorians? 3 of them. 1 young, 2 older, judging by the voices. Course they have helmets like you, don't they? And they were wearing... Jusik cut in, suddenly very intent on the question. Green armor. They wore dark green armor, didn't they? Leb blinked. Yeah. He defocused for a moment as if he was trying to visualize something. Yeah, they wore dark green. How did you know? A hunch, Jusik said. Sev was almost pushed aside now. Whatever Jusik had on his mind, whatever intel he hadn't shared it with them. He'd busted a gut to get here, though. I can work out who they are. Now tell me where you took the equipment. Dorama. Jusik leaned back as if he had his answer, as if the identity of whoever else had shaken down Leb mattered more to him than the delivery destination Kosai's likely location. Sev was distracted by that, trying to construct a scenario in which that information mattered more. You want to pin that down? Boss asked, and indicated Sev. Or do I let my colleague ask you? Tropics Island Resort. Leb sounded fluent, as if he'd rehearsed it, or at least given the same answers before. You want the coordinates? Here they are. He put his hand inside his tunic and froze. Hey, it's just a data pad. Take it easy. Sev realized he must have looked as if he was going to hit him. He wondered how he managed to give the impression of being more violent than his brothers, because any armored commando with a Dis looked like bad news. He wasn't trying to act like a psycho, whatever build-up Boss gave him, but folks didn't feel comfortable sharing a space with him, and whatever he intended didn't seem to affect that. "I'll take the data," Jusik said quietly. He held his hand out for Leb's datapad, tapped the controls, and keyed something into his own device. Then he handed it back. "Hey!" Leb stared at his datapad in horror. "You erased it!" "I'm so clumsy," Jusik said. "Come on, let's see you safely on your way, shall we?" "But my data?" Jusik crooked his finger at Sev to accompany him, and they bundled Leb out of the TIV so fast that he almost fell out of the hatch. The two of them held onto an arm each and steered him toward his freighter. "Don't I get some creds for my trouble?" Leb said. Jusik slapped something into his palm. "Not just that, citizen. I'll make the problem disappear, too." He stared into the Twi'lek's face and put his hand flat on his chest for a moment. "In a few minutes, things will be back to normal for you. Now off you go." Leb stood at the foot of the ladder up to his cockpit and seemed to be contemplating the contents of his palm as Jusik and Sev jogged back to the TIOY. There was a small, anonymous-looking shuttle a little distance from it, one that Sev had seen Jusik use before. "What did you give him, sir?" Sev asked. "A few hundred creds and a spot of amnesia." "What?" "I mind-rubbed him." "Oh, you can do that too, can you?" "No point deleting the records on his datapad if he remembers them and remembers us." There was a low rumble behind them. Sev turned to see Leb's ship powering up, driving clouds of dust and grit into the air with the downdraft of its thrusters. "But whoever's after Kosai can still find him, except he won't be able to give them an answer this time. So how does that solve his problem?" "I didn't say it would solve his," Jusik said, "but it certainly solves some of ours. It wasn't very Jedi of him, but then maybe Sev didn't fully understand their beliefs. What about those Mandalorians? You sounded like you knew something." Jusik shrugged and opened the hatch on his shuttle with a gesture of his hand. It might have been some force trick or simply a remote control. "Let's just say Kosai's in demand." "But who are they?" "Competition. I'll catch up with you later." Sev accepted need to know even if it annoyed him. He watched Jusik disappear into the shuttle and rejoin Delta in the TIV, trying to work out what he felt about Mandalorians and whether they were all like him. "The generals scrambled the Twi'lek's brains," he said, slumping into a seat and fastening his restraining belt for takeoff. "So he isn't going to be discussing his travel arrangements with anyone else, at least." Boss tutted in annoyance. "We should have asked him for a bit more detail about where he did the drop, but Jusik seemed really keen to get rid of him." "Well, he knows something we don't." Nobody said it, but Sev knew they were thinking it. Mandalorians. It was always sobering to run into them or the mention of them, and find they were on the Separatist side or on no side at all, but not the Republic's allies. Like most of the commandos, Delta Squad had been raised and trained by Mandalorian sergeants. Men like Wallen Vao had done what generations of Mando fathers had done, raising their sons to be self-sufficient warriors, passing on a Mandalorian culture that made strong, tight-knit armies. "Yeah, but they're S-Mando and they're S-Mando. Is that me? Is that who I really am? And how do real Mandos see us? Omega were very Mando now. All Skirata's squads were. He was a real hardliner, old Cal, all tradition, emotional sentimentality, and if anyone got in his way, complete no-holds-barred violence. Sometimes Sev preferred Vao's cold distance because it was for their own good. But there were times he envied Omega. Vao said Skirata was too soft and made weak soldiers, but all Sev saw was someone he didn't have to be afraid of and who would let him make mistakes. Too late to think about that now. "Okay, Dorama, it is," said Boss. "Hope you packed the swimwear, Fixer." Tropics Island Resort, Dorama, Kularan System, 478 days after Geonosis. Tropics was a manufactured paradise with every facility a sun-seeking visitor might want, and as far from Skirata's idea of bliss as he could imagine. It was a separatist planet, at least as far as the Kalaran system was seployal. Skirata felt everywhere was enemy territory regardless of whether it was red, blue, or yellow on the charts, and didn't let the stereotyped idol weaken his guard. "Well, this is classy," he said. Beings of various species lounged on a white sand beach lapped by a turquoise sea so vividly blue that it could have been dyed. Twi'lek waitresses, whose skin almost matched it, wandered among the vacation airs with trays of drinks. Droids trundled between, raking sand and somehow managing to leave no tracks behind them. "Imagine being stuck here for 2 weeks. What do you reckon, Marika?" Muriel shrugged. Out of armor, in a plain white shirt and beige pants, he suddenly looked so ordinary, so civilian, that Skirata could only think of all the routine things he was denied. "I could probably find something to occupy me," Muriel said. "Do you two realize how much you look like glitter stim dealers?" Val looked back over his shoulder, a rather splendid pearl-inlaid blaster shimmering in his holster. "I'm going for the casual but menacing look. Glad I pulled it off." "It's the Era Kid special, Wallon. Says more about you than credits ever can." The gangster look was less conspicuous here than full Mandalorian armor. The idea was to look like they'd come for sport fishing so that submerging Ihan offshore didn't attract the wrong sort of interest. "Looks rather expensive." "Another bauble from the Vow deposit box. My great-grandfather is said to have shot a servant with it for serving his calf too hot." Skirata almost went for the bait. "You're just saying that to make me mad, aren't you?" Vow's expression was unreadable. "You know I'd never do such a thing." Muriel put a restraining hand on Skirata's shoulder as he overtook him. The terrible thing about Vow and his family was that it was perfectly possible. Instead, Skirata tried to concentrate on the inexplicably generous Vow, the man who'd just given him millions for the frankly sentimental and unselfish purpose of rescuing clones, rather than the sadistic martinet who'd nearly killed Otten to toughen him up. "Udesi," Muriel muttered. "Take it easy, Kalbuir." Skirata did his best. He took a deep breath as he walked into the lobby of the resort's huge hotel complex and focused on being a glitterstim baron on a short break. He was a nondescript, short, gray-haired, middle-aged man who could pass unnoticed as a vagrant in the right clothes, or bring a room to a halt simply by walking with the right degree of swagger. Today he could play a prince. He had a fortune in the safe on board Ihan, so thinking like the idle and disreputable rich was easy. He was both. A tall female wreck looked down at him. Skirata had seen them working as bounty hunters. Their ultra-thin, whip-like bodies came in handy for accessing awkward locations. But it was a surprise to come across one in the hospitality business. This one didn't appear to have a sense of humor. He decided to skip the diet jokes. "Do we need a permit for angling here, ma'am?" Skirata asked innocently. "We've come for the reefy fishing." "Yes," she said, not exactly personifying hospitable. She fixed him with a disturbing purple eye. "Are you guests?" "No, we have a marine vessel moored here." "Well, there'll be a fee for berthing. Do you wish to hire tackle too?" "Oh, we've come very well prepared, thanks." "And you'll have to sign a waiver, because Tropics resorts cannot be held responsible for any death, injury, damage, or other untoward incident caused by or relating to hunting, fishing, or exploration in any area more than 10 meters offshore, or beyond a depth of 50 meters. Skirata smiled indulgently, waste of time though it was, and took out a stylus. "We're used to taking risks, ma'am. Where do I sign? How long will this permit need to cover? How long to find the hiding hole that Kosai had created for herself? Maybe hours, maybe days. If they were unlucky, weeks, and when they found it, there was always a chance that the Iowa bait would have moved on again." "Give me a week's pass," Skirata said, slapping his credit chip on the desk. "If we find we have more time to kill, I'll extend it." The wreck checked the chip in her scanner. "Thank you, Master Nesson." Skirata flinched at the bogus ID. "I must advise caution if you fish beyond the 500-meter limits. We do have people go missing from time to time when they ignore the warnings. But that's part of the appeal for many anglers and divers who come here. Val did his icy "I know something you don't" smile. Sport fishing isn't sport unless you run the risk of being caught yourself, is it? There's always relaxing on the beach, said the wreck, or a pleasant walk around the harbor. She seemed to have classed them as two old guys trying to rediscover their youth through destructive machismo, maybe with Mariel as the fit young minder who could haul them out of trouble. It was perfect. Whoever Kosai had as a contact here, and she'd need one if only to get hold of supplies, wouldn't be tipped off to the fact that Mandalorian bounty hunters were in town. Ihan didn't look too conspicuous on one of the pontoons that stretched out into the azure water. Most of the vessels alongside showed no signs of ever having slipped their moorings, but there were a few more rugged craft that were clearly from off-world. Skirata took out his datapad and aimed the scanner discreetly in their direction to check the passive transponders just in case. He found no registrations that worried him. "You have to hand it to the investment group here," he said as they tried to look casual. "They take a disaster and turn it into a USP. "You're so crass," Val muttered. "What's a USP?" Mariel asked. "Unique selling point, son. As in, they made a complete shook when they terraformed the place, not knowing just what kind of wildlife was in the ice when they thawed the planet. There are some real nasties lurking underwater, but instead of saying, 'Ooh, that's too dangerous, let us scrub the resort' idea, the tourist board touts it as an opportunity for wild adventure. I have to respect that kind of resilience in business." Mariel smiled to himself. "Until the lawsuits come rolling in." "Just operating costs," Skirata said. "Overheads." The three men climbed onto Ayahan and sat on a flat section of her casing, backs resting against the curve of the port cargo bay, looking out to sea. Myrd sat with its nose pointing into the wind, sniffing happily. Skirata didn't know a lot about sport angling, although he could manage to catch fish if he ever had to, and he hoped there wasn't some giveaway sign of a real angler that was conspicuously missing. If push came to shove, he could always play the stim baron on his first fishing trip. "The Iowa bait has to have a resupply route," he said. "She can't just go to ground here and have no contact with anyone. How does she get her food? She's not the kind that lives off the land. She's used to having minions." "Sea," said Mariel. "What? Live off the sea, not the land." "Well, Kaminoan discipline or not, she has to eat something." "Let's do a little exploring," said Val. "We have the chart. Oh yeah, Myrd." Myrd stood up, paws slipping on the smooth hull, and looked around frantically at the command to hunt. The Strill couldn't sense any prey. Val leaned over and ruffled its loose folds of gold fur, pointing at the water. Strills could fly and glide, but swimming wasn't their forte. Myrd rumbled with disappointed frustration. "It's okay, Myrd, I'll let you hunt Kaminoan soon," Skirata said. He wondered if he was getting soft. He'd always disliked the animal, even if he couldn't blame it for its savagery given a master like Val. Now he saw its talents, if not its charm. "Soon, okay?" Myrd's eyes had that focus and intensity that suggested it understood Skirata perfectly, and it settled down again with its huge head in Val's lap. Mariel slid his sun visor into place and leaned back against the curve of the hull, fingers meshed behind his head. "Let's narrow down the search range first," he said, pointing. "Look, check out the speed." Moving across the harbor, well within the safe turquoise shallows, was a powered barge with aquata divers getting ready to explore the underwater world, wearing a bizarre array of brightly colored swimwear that said they didn't dive for a living. The hull looked like the barges tied up on nearby pontoons in Tropics Resort livery. This was what the staff here used to get around the perfectly planned, ideally spaced island chain, and this was what the Twi'lek must have used to move Kosai's equipment and droids out to sea. If they worked out the speed the barges could cruise and factored in the weight of the cargo the Twi'lek had delivered, they'd get a radius within which to search. Skirata aimed his datapad, laying it flat on his knee and letting it track the barge. I was never very good at this. It was just a matter of timing it across a set distance, using the datapad like one of those gizmos that CSF sometimes use to track speeders. Well, I make that 15 clicks an hour. Muriel slid along the hull and checked over his shoulder. So that means if the barge went out to some RV point and returned in half an hour, we're looking at a maximum range of maybe 10 clicks if it was moving faster, and that's being optimistic. Let's take the search out to the 15-click radius then, just to be sure. Val keyed in the data and projected the holochart onto the hull. This is three-dimensional, remember? A concave relief chart formed like a mesh basket in blue light that was hard to see in the sunlight. That's the underwater topography in a 15-click radius from the coordinates the Twi'lek gave us. Even in these lighting conditions, Skirata could see the indentations of cave mouths under the waterline. The charts only went down as far as 50 meters. It was as good a place as any to start looking. Who did the hydrography for the developers? Muriel asked. They put that 50-meter limit in for a reason, because they must have known what was below it. They didn't just stop looking because it was time for a calf break. I don't think there's the equivalent of City Hall here, Skirata said. We can't just stroll in and ask the local planning chief if we can look through his database. That's the problem with commercially owned planets. Val opened the top hatch and motion mirrored inside. Where's your spirit of adventure, Cal? Have overpriced deepwater hybrid we'll explore. I got this tub for a good price. Insulting Skirata's ability to drive a deal was marginally worse than questioning his courage, and he realized Val had baited him yet again. And I wonder what you'd do with yourself if you didn't have me to torment. Val raised one eyebrow. Now, that was annoying, dumb insolence. It really was. But Skirata ignored the impulse, thought of the fortune Val had handed over to him as if it were a cred chip he'd found on the street, and stood up. Muriel slipped the mooring line and prepared to get underway. The islands were constructed on the tops of natural peaks jutting from the sea, like porceplast crowns on the stumps of teeth. Once submerged, it was simply a matter of doing what he'd do on land if he was hunting an animal in a lair, looking for signs of activity, checking out cave mouths and venturing inside. It was just a recce, just a discreet dive to scope out the topography that wasn't shown on any of the charts, so they could come back later to stage a planned assault. But if an opportunity presented itself, they'd take it. Outside the transparasteel bubble that formed a clear dome over the cockpit, a tourist brochure of an underwater world drifted past them in vividly colored serenity. Myrd seemed fascinated, pressing a snotty nose to the transparasteel and making excited grumbling noises, and Skirata risked reaching out to haul the strill back by its collar and wipe the viewport clean. Filthy thing, but it has its uses, just like us. Val took the hint and beckoned to Myrd to sit on his lap. Relations had definitely relaxed between Skirata and Val. There was a time when they'd have brawled over less. Ihan dropped below 60 meters, past the charted depth. The water was surprisingly clear. Lacy weeds swayed gracefully in the currents. Brilliant pink and yellow fish like ribbons wove themselves between the fronds, flashing displays of lights like a Coruscant casino. That's more like it, Muriel said, sounding pleased. The navigation display stripped away the layer of marine life and showed a three-dimensional landscape of slopes marked with fissures and channels that penetrated deep into the face of the submerged mountain, forming the one island within the 15-kilometer zone. Ihan came alongside a deep shadow that appeared as a hole on the sensors. Worth a ping, said Muriel. Let's just line up the sensors and see how far into that feature we can map. You okay with this, son? Yes, Calbuer. He turned the vessel 90 degrees and pointed Ihan's nose at the opening for a deep scan. Now, that's a likely one. Goes back 100 meters at least. Mark that on the chart, please, Sergeant Val. He turned to Skirata. I'm several pages ahead of Ordo in the manual now. There'd be a contest later, Skirata could tell. Ordo and Muriel, a double act right from the time he'd met them as 2-year-old clone kids. No names, just numbers, and already handling blasters. sometimes indulged in a little rivalry and one-upmanship. It explained Muriel's love of risk-taking. He had to edge out of Ordo's shadow somehow. They worked along the 30 kilometers of submerged coastline, checking and scanning cave after cave. Some were immediately obvious as dead ends when the sonar scan was mapped onto the three-dimensional view, just depressions in the rock that went nowhere. Some were so deep and twisted that the sonar didn't find an end, and those were marked. As Muriel eased Ihan through the extraordinary forest of weed and marine creatures, some of which slapped sucker-like mouthparts onto the cockpit bubble as if testing the ship for flavor. Skirata kept an eye out for signs of disturbance to the environment that might indicate recent construction work. If Kosai was here, she'd only been in residence for a few months. Signs of activity might still be around fresh-cut rock face, debris from cave mouths, any number of telltale signs that she'd had a hideaway built down here. Val stared out of the dome too, with Murd mirroring his posture as exactly as a six-legged animal ever could, blinking from time to time and pausing once or twice to turn and gaze at its master before giving him an enthusiastic and slobbery lick across the face with a dripping gray tongue. Skirata shuddered, but at least there was one being in the galaxy that loved Val unconditionally. Firfek, if he'd started feeling sorry for the Chakar after so many years, it was a bad sign. The fortune was just creds Val had no use for, Skirata told himself, something he wanted to deny his own privileged class, and that simply happened to be useful in the plan to rescue clones an afterthought. It's not true, though, is it? He's a Mando, too. The same thing that drew him to Mandalore is the same thing that kept me there. We chose it. Maybe I hate him because of the parts of him that are too much like me. All stop, Val said suddenly. Myrd stiffened, always sensitive to Val's reactions. The Strill was hunting, even if it couldn't get out there and taste the scents and currents. Muriel brought the ship to a halt, and she drifted, silent except for the hum of the shields and environment controls. Val pointed ahead, slightly to port. In that weed forest, look. Ihan's exterior holocams trained in the direction of Val's finger and Myrd's snout. The weed was thick and populated by shoals of glowing orange discs that could have been fish, worms, or swimming crustaceans. The impression was one of a Tapcaf courtyard strung with decorative lights. Not all the weed was pale green. Some looked white in the aquamarine light. Skirata strained to focus, and then a current moved the weed a little more, and he realized he wasn't looking at weed at all, but bones. It was a skeleton. Shab, Muriel muttered. I think we're too late for resuscitation, Calbuir. I hope he bought travel insurance. Skirata couldn't see any marks on the bones at this distance. Or she. Who died down here? And why? The skeleton was swaying in the current as if dancing with the weed. It was definitely a humanoid of some kind, picked clean and as white as an anatomical specimen, although a closer inspection, as close as they could get without leaving the vessel, showed a few colonies of pale yellow growths that looked like closed shadow barnacles. It was hard to see what was holding it down. If the flesh was gone, the connective tissue that held the bones together should have been gone too. Skirata couldn't think of a species that fitted the bill, but it didn't matter. He or she wasn't going anywhere. Diver who ignored the hazard warnings? Val asked. Skirata's instinct for bad signs was more reliable than any sonar. What kind of marine life eats a diving suit and apparatus as well as the meat? Muriel, engrossed in the controls for the external security holocam, let out a long breath. And when did you last see a fish with fingers? He said quietly, switching the holocam image to one of the large monitors. Look. The close-up view of the weed bed that swayed around the skeleton's ankles like a deep pile carpet showed a splash of bright orange. As Muriel magnified the image and went in for a close-up, Skirata realized what it was. Muriel was right. There weren't too many marine species that could take a length of fiber cord and secure a body to a rock. The close view on the monitor showed a knot, a competent, non-slipping textbook Keldaby anchoring bend. In a galaxy of loop rings, gription panels, and 100 high-tech ways of attaching things, few people bother to learn to tie knots properly, let alone one as distinctive and complex as that. Very few people indeed, only clone soldiers and Mandalorians,